Overthinking does not look dangerous when it begins. It usually starts as something small, a question, a memory, a text you reread one too many times, a conversation you replay because something felt off, a future scenario you keep trying to solve before it happens. And at first, it feels almost responsible, like you are being careful, like you are trying to understand, like you are protecting yourself from mistakes. But then the loop begins. One thought becomes 5. 5 become 20. And before you realize it, your mind is no longer trying to help you. It is trapping you. You are not finding clarity. You are feeding repetition. You are not solving the problem, you are multiplying it. And the worst part is that overthinking often disguises itself as intelligence. It sounds thoughtful. It sounds deep. It sounds like caution. But in real life, it steals energy, kills momentum, ruins peace, and turns simple situations into mental storms. That is why this episode matters, because most people do not need more thoughts. They need a way to stop giving every thought that much power. They need to know how to catch the loop early, separate facts from interpretations, stop asking impossible questions, interrupt the body-mind cycle, act before fear multiplies, and build a mind that can live without solving every uncertainty before it moves. So in this episode, I want to walk you through 12 lessons that can help you stop overthinking fast. Not with fake positivity, not with vague advice, with practical shifts that make your mind less noisy, less obsessive, and much easier to live in. Because overthinking does not make you safer, it just makes you tired. The first lesson is this: catch the loop before it becomes a spiral. This is where overthinking is easiest to stop, and also where most people fail to notice it. Because overthinking rarely announces itself clearly. It does not begin by saying, "I am about to ruin your peace for the next 2 hours." It begins much more quietly than that. One small thought, one uncomfortable question, one memory that feels unresolved, one moment that your mind decides to return to. And if you do not catch it early, the mind starts building around it. That is how the spiral begins. A single thought by itself is not the problem. Reflection is not the enemy. Thinking is not the enemy. The problem starts when the mind stops moving forward and starts circling, when the same question keeps returning with no new insight, when the same scene keeps replaying with slightly different wording, when the same fear keeps expanding even though nothing new has happened. That is the shift you need to learn to recognize. The moment thought stops being useful and starts becoming repetitive. Most people do not catch that moment because it feels productive at first. They think they are still analyzing, still processing, still trying to understand. But what is really happening is much simpler. The mind is looping. It is not discovering. It is repeating. And repetition creates emotional heat. The more you stay inside the loop, the more the thought starts to feel urgent, serious and heavy simply because it has been repeated so many times. Think about how often this happens in ordinary life. You send a message and do not get a reply. At first, it is just a moment. Then the mind enters. Did I say something wrong? Are they upset? Should I have phrased that differently? Maybe I sounded cold. Maybe I sounded too eager. Then, 10 minutes later, you are no longer responding to a delayed reply. You are inside a full emotional spiral, built from one small trigger your mind was allowed to keep chewing. That is why the first skill is not to win the spiral after it gets huge. It is to catch it when it is still small. The earlier you catch it, the less power it gains. You want to learn to notice the exact moment your mind shifts from one clean thought into compulsive return. The moment it starts revisiting instead of resolving. That is the signal. That is the opening where control is still possible. A simple question helps here. Is this thought moving me toward clarity, or is it just pulling me back into itself? If the answer is that nothing new is being added, then you are already in the loop. And once you see that clearly, you stop treating repetition like insight. You stop giving the spiral credit it did not earn. Because the real danger of overthinking is not the first thought. It is the second, third, and 10th return to it without interruption. And once you learn to catch that early, the next skill becomes much easier. You stop entering every thought as if it were reality, and start naming what is happening before it swallows you. The second lesson is this: name the thought instead of entering it. This is one of the fastest ways to weaken overthinking before it takes over. Because the mind becomes much more powerful when it stays vague, when it feels like reality instead of a mental event, when you are inside it instead of looking at it. That is why people get trapped so easily. A thought appears, and instead of noticing that a thought is happening, they merge with it. Fear feels like truth. Doubt feels like evidence. Mental rehearsal feels like preparation. And the moment that happens, the mind is no longer being observed. It is being obeyed. Naming breaks that spell. The moment you can say, this is fear, this is doubt, this is projection, this is replay, or this is my mind trying to control uncertainty, something changes. You create distance. Not huge distance, but enough. Enough to stop becoming the thought. Enough to stop treating every sentence in your head like a command or a revelation. That distance matters more than people realize, because overthinking feeds on identification. It grows when you believe the thought completely from the inside. It weakens when you begin to recognize its pattern from the outside. If you can name it, you are no longer fully inside it. You are beginning to see it as process instead of truth. And once a person can do that, the mind loses some of its authority immediately. Think about how different it feels to say, "What if I ruined everything?" versus, "This is catastrophic thinking." Or, "They probably think I am stupid," versus, "This is insecurity looking for proof." Or, "I need to keep replaying this so I do not make the same mistake," versus, "This is mental rehearsal trying to create false control." The content may not vanish right away, but the grip changes. The thought stops sounding like pure reality and starts sounding like a familiar pattern. That is the real power of naming. It does not always make the thought disappear. It makes it easier to stop entering it, and that is enough to change the trajectory of a moment. Because every time you do not fully enter the thought, you deny it more room to build. You stop feeding it with identification. You stop becoming its host. This is especially useful because not every thought needs deeper analysis. Some thoughts only need clearer recognition. You do not always need to solve them. You need to label them accurately enough that they stop pretending to be wisdom. The anxious mind hates that. It wants full immersion. It wants you inside the movie. Naming pulls you back into the seat. And once you can do that, another hard truth becomes obvious. A lot of overthinking is built on questions your mind was never capable of answering in the first place. The third lesson is this: stop asking questions your mind cannot answer. This is where a lot of overthinking becomes self-inflicted torture, because the mind keeps returning to questions that sound important, but are built in a way that guarantees no real resolution. What if I made the wrong choice? What do they really think of me? Did I ruin everything? What if something goes wrong later? What if I missed something? What if there is a hidden meaning I still have not understood? These questions create the feeling of depth, but most of them do not lead anywhere solid. They keep the mind busy without moving it toward truth. That is the trap. An anxious mind believes that if it thinks long enough, it can force certainty out of uncertainty. It believes more thinking will finally produce the one answer that brings peace. But many of the questions feeding overthinking have no final answer available in the moment. Not because you are stupid, because the answer does not exist yet, cannot be known, or was never fully knowable in the first place. And when you keep asking unanswerable questions, your mind stays locked in permanent review mode. Think about how this works in real life. Someone's tone changes slightly, and your mind starts asking, are they upset with me? Did I say something wrong? Are they pulling away? But unless they tell you directly, your mind is often working with fragments, guesses, and fear. Or you make a decision and start asking, what if the other option was better? But you cannot live both futures at once to compare them perfectly. Or you replay a conversation and ask, what did they really mean by that? But meaning is often messy, layered, and impossible to pin down with certainty from the outside. So the more you demand a final answer from the mind, the more trapped you become. This is why one of the most practical skills in stopping overthinking is learning to ask, is this a real question or an unresolvable one? A real question can often lead to an action, a decision, a conversation, a fact, or a next step. An unresolvable question usually leads to more spinning, more interpretation, more emotional exhaustion. It gives the mind movement without progress. And that distinction is everything. If the question cannot be answered right now, then continuing to feed it is not intelligence. It is mental friction. It is the mind pretending that enough repetition will create control. But control is not always available. Sometimes the only honest move is to stop demanding certainty where certainty does not exist. That does not mean you become careless. It means you become more disciplined with what kinds of questions you allow into your mind. You stop treating every what if like an assignment. You stop assuming every uncertainty must be solved immediately. You stop giving endless attention to problems your mind is structurally incapable of resolving in that moment. And once you stop doing that, something gets much easier. You stop living inside interpretations and start returning to what is actually real. The fourth lesson is this: return to facts, not interpretations. This is one of the fastest ways to calm an overactive mind, because overthinking almost always grows in the gap between what happened and what you think it means. The event itself is often small. The story around it is what becomes enormous. A message gets shorter than usual. That is the fact. You start thinking they are losing interest, annoyed with you, pulling away, hiding something, or silently judging you. That is the interpretation. You make a mistake in a meeting. That is the fact. Your mind starts telling you everyone noticed, everyone thinks less of you now, and this one moment exposed everything weak about you. That is the interpretation. This is how the mind turns ordinary uncertainty into emotional chaos. It adds story too quickly and then reacts to the story as if it were reality. That is why facts matter so much. Facts are grounding. Interpretations are combustible. When you are overthinking, your mind hates facts because facts are usually too limited for the drama it wants to build. Facts do not support the full spiral. Facts are often simple, incomplete, and emotionally unsatisfying. They say, "This happened." The anxious mind wants something bigger. It wants, "This happened, and here is why your future is now in danger." That is where suffering multiplies. So one of the cleanest things you can do in the middle of a spiral is force the separation. Ask yourself, what do I know for sure, and what am I adding? That question cuts through a huge amount of noise. Maybe what you know is only this: they have not replied yet. Maybe what you know is, I made one awkward comment. Maybe what you know is, I feel anxious right now. Maybe what you know is, I do not have enough information yet. Those facts may not feel satisfying, but they are honest. And honesty stabilizes the mind much faster than imagination does. The problem is that many people trust their interpretations more when they are emotional. They think because it feels intense, it must be accurate, but intensity is not proof. Anxiety can make stories feel urgent. Shame can make assumptions feel certain. Fear can make a possibility feel like a prediction. That does not make any of them true. This is why returning to facts is not cold. It is protective. It keeps the mind from building an entire emotional structure on top of one incomplete moment. It helps you stay in contact with reality before the story hardens into identity, panic, or regret. And once you do that, you begin to notice something else. Sometimes the mind is already too activated to be reasoned with cleanly. Sometimes the fastest way out is not more analysis at all. It is the body. The fifth lesson is this: use the body to interrupt the mind. This is where a lot of people lose time they never needed to lose. They stay inside the spiral and keep trying to think their way out of it, as if one more round of analysis will suddenly create relief. But once the mind is already activated, more thought often just gives the loop more material. At that point, the most effective interruption is often physical, not intellectual. Because the body can break a pattern faster than analysis can. When you are overthinking, your mind is usually not acting alone. Your breathing changes, your posture tightens, your jaw sets, your chest gets smaller. Your nervous system starts behaving as if something urgent is happening, even if you're just sitting in a room replaying a text message. Then the body feeds the mind, and the mind feeds the body, and together they build a state that feels much more serious than the original trigger ever deserved. That is why movement matters so much. Stand up, walk, wash your face, change rooms, breathe deeper than the thought wants you to, put cold water on your hands, open your chest instead of folding into yourself, get out of the exact physical position where the spiral is feeding itself. These things sound too simple to work. That is why people underestimate them. But the mind is much easier to interrupt when the body stops cooperating with the panic. Think about how different a thought can feel when you are hunched over in bed at midnight, staring at the ceiling, versus when you are standing upright, breathing fully, walking outside, and forcing your attention back into the physical world. The thought may not disappear instantly, but its environment changes, and that matters. Because overthinking needs certain conditions to grow: stillness without awareness, tension without release, isolation without structure. The body can either feed those conditions or break them. This is especially important because not every mental storm is a deep message. Sometimes you are not uncovering truth. You are just stuck in an activated state. Your mind is reading danger because your system feels overloaded. In those moments, arguing with the thought may not be the right move. Regulating the body is. A simple rule helps here. If the mind is looping and the body is tight, move before you analyze. Do something that changes your state first. Not because movement solves everything, but because a calmer body gives you a better mind to work with. And once the body is no longer feeding the loop, another part of overthinking becomes easier to face. A lot of spirals continue because the decision was left open too long, and the longer it stays open, the more versions your mind creates. The sixth lesson is this: make a decision before your mind creates 10 more versions. A lot of overthinking survives because the mind is being given too much open space, too many unresolved choices, too many half-decisions, too many situations where nothing has been closed, so everything stays mentally active. And once a decision remains open for too long, the mind starts multiplying possibilities. One option becomes 3, 3 become 10. Then each version grows its own risks, meanings, consequences, and imagined futures. That is how a simple decision becomes mental noise. Most people think they are overthinking because they care deeply. Sometimes that is true, but often they are overthinking because they refuse to close the door on any option. They want a perfect answer, a guaranteed outcome, a version of reality where no regret is possible, so they keep reviewing, comparing, rehearsing, and waiting. But the longer the decision stays open, the more emotional charge it gathers. Soon, you are no longer deciding. You are managing a whole internal courtroom, and that courtroom never rests. This is why imperfect decisions often bring more peace than endless internal debate. Not because every quick decision is wise, but because clarity usually comes from committed movement, not from unlimited comparison. Once you decide, the mind has less empty space to decorate. The path may still require adjustment, but at least the spiral loses one of its favorite fuel sources: prolonged indecision. Think about how often this happens in ordinary life. You are deciding whether to send the message, make the call, apply for something, leave something, commit to something, say no, say yes, change direction, or set a boundary. At first, it's a clean choice, but then the mind enters and starts generating alternatives. Maybe later, maybe another version, maybe a better moment. Maybe I should wait. Maybe I should gather more data. Maybe I should imagine every possible reaction first. And before long, the original decision is buried under layers of imagined consequences. That is not wisdom. It is delay disguised as caution. A strong mind learns when enough thinking has already happened. It learns when the cost of not deciding has become greater than the risk of choosing. Because there comes a point where keeping the question open is no longer protecting you. It is draining you. It is making you live in hypothetical futures instead of the actual next step available now. A useful question helps here. Do I need more information, or do I need more courage? That question cuts through a lot of false complexity, because many people keep calling their problem uncertainty when the real problem is reluctance. They already know enough. They just do not want the discomfort that comes with choosing. But choosing is often what restores peace, not because every choice will feel perfect, but because a closed loop is easier to live with than an endlessly multiplying one. And once you understand that, the next move becomes clear. Even after a decision is made, the mind will still try to replay, recheck, and reopen things, which is why you need another discipline too. You need a limit on mental review. The seventh lesson is this: set a limit on mental review. This is where overthinking often pretends to be responsibility. The mind tells you that if you just review the situation one more time, you will finally understand it properly. You will catch what you missed. You will prevent the mistake from happening again. You will find the detail that explains everything. But in reality, mental review has a point of usefulness, and then it crosses a line. After that line, it is no longer reflection. It is self-torment. That line matters, because review feels intelligent, it feels disciplined, it feels like you are being careful. But if you keep going long after nothing new is emerging, then you are not reviewing anymore. You are reopening, rebuilding, re-injuring. You are letting the mind keep chewing on something because it still believes repetition will create control. It will not. It will only deepen the groove. This is why you need a limit. Not because thinking is bad, but because unlimited thinking is almost never productive. A strong mind knows when enough reflection has already happened. It knows that a mistake can be acknowledged without becoming a full-day mental courtroom. It knows that a conversation can be learned from without being replayed 20 times. It knows that a decision can be checked once or twice without being kept under permanent internal surveillance. Think about how often people say they are still thinking about it, when what they really mean is they are still letting it disturb them. That disturbance is not proof that more thinking is needed. Often it is proof that the mind is undisciplined with review. It keeps going back not because there is new value there, but because it has learned to confuse repetition with safety. That is why giving yourself a limit can be so powerful. 10 minutes, 15, one page of notes, one deliberate review, then stop. This is what happened. This is what I learned. This is what I will do next time. Done. The point is not to force fake closure. The point is to stop pretending that endless mental return is wisdom. Because the longer review stays open, the more it starts feeding identity instead of insight. Now, you are no longer just learning from the moment. You are letting the moment define how you see yourself. One awkward comment becomes proof that you are socially weak. One mistake becomes proof that you ruin things. One uncertain interaction becomes proof that you are hard to love. That is what happens when review has no limit. It stops serving growth and starts serving self-destruction. So if you want to stop overthinking, learn to close the review window before the mind turns it into punishment. Learn what enough looks like. Learn how to leave a thought before it starts feeding on you. And once you can do that, another move becomes obvious. The fastest way to weaken mental noise is not always to reduce it directly. Sometimes the fastest move is to replace it with action immediately. The 8th lesson is this: replace mental noise with one immediate action. This is where overthinking often loses its grip the fastest, because rumination needs empty space. It needs delay. It needs hesitation. It needs you sitting still long enough for the mind to keep multiplying possibilities without being interrupted by reality. Action cuts through that. Not because action solves everything, but because action changes the environment in which overthinking survives. A lot of people stay trapped because they keep trying to think themselves into momentum. They want to feel clear first, certain first, ready first. So they wait. They sit with the thought, analyze it, reframe it, review it. But while they are doing all that, the mind keeps expanding. The fear gets more detailed. The situation gets heavier. The next step starts feeling bigger than it was when the thought first appeared. That is what rumination does. It inflates life while keeping you motionless. Action breaks that inflation. Think about how quickly a spiral can weaken the moment you do one concrete thing. Send the email, write the list, stand up and clean the room, answer the message simply. Put the document on the screen, book the appointment, leave the house, open the notes, start the first 5 minutes. The action does not need to be heroic. It needs to be real. Real enough that the mind is no longer the only place where the situation is happening. That is why action is so powerful against rumination. It moves you from imagined complexity to actual contact. The mind hates that sometimes because reality is less dramatic than speculation. But that is exactly the point. Action shrinks the emotional fog by forcing contact with what is actually here, not what your mind keeps predicting. This matters especially because many people overthink as a substitute for movement. They tell themselves they are processing, preparing, being careful, being thoughtful. But often they are just postponing friction. And the longer friction is postponed, the more power the mind gains. That is why one immediate action matters so much. It interrupts the pattern before the pattern becomes identity. A useful rule helps here. When the mind gets noisy, make the body or environment do something concrete within the next 60 seconds. Not tomorrow. Not after one more round of thought. Now. The point is to deny the spiral the idle space it needs to grow, because overthinking is strongest in abstraction. Action drags it back into the world, and once you start doing that consistently, another important realization appears. Not every feeling that enters your mind deserves investigation. Some feelings are not insight at all. They are just passing states that became too important because you kept listening. The 9th lesson is this: stop treating every emotion like a message. This is where a lot of overthinking hides behind false depth. People feel anxious, restless, heavy, irritated, emotionally off, and immediately assume the feeling must mean something important. They begin searching for the hidden reason, the buried truth, the deeper signal. But not every emotion is insight. Not every feeling is a revelation, and not every shift in your internal state deserves a full investigation. Sometimes a feeling is just a feeling. That sounds simple, but it changes a lot once you really understand it. Because the overthinking mind does not like unexplained emotion. It wants to decode everything. It wants to turn every uncomfortable state into a puzzle. Why do I feel weird? Why do I feel distant? Why am I uneasy? Why do I suddenly feel doubtful? Why do I feel emotionally flat? And in many cases, the investigation creates more suffering than the original feeling ever did. This is especially true when the body is tired, overstimulated, underslept, emotionally overloaded, or carrying tension that has not been released. Anxiety can come from exhaustion. Irritability can come from overstimulation. Sadness can come from depletion. Restlessness can come from too much input and too little stillness. But if you treat every state like a deep message about your life, your relationships, your identity, or your future, you turn ordinary human fluctuation into psychological drama. That is how the mind exhausts itself. Think about how often people feel something at night and immediately make it meaningful. A wave of anxiety becomes proof that something is wrong. A moment of emotional distance becomes proof that a relationship is broken. A sudden heaviness becomes proof that life is going in the wrong direction. But the emotional state itself may have been temporary, physical, or situational. The overthinking mind is what made it philosophical. That is why this lesson matters so much. You need to stop granting every emotion investigative authority. Some emotions need to be felt without being analyzed. Some need rest, food, sleep, movement, quiet, or time, not interpretation. Some are residue, not revelation. Some are weather, not truth. A powerful question helps here. Is this emotion asking for wisdom or just regulation? If what you need is sleep, stillness, breathing, movement, or less stimulation, then deeper analysis may only make the state worse. At that point, the mind is not clarifying. It is overreading. This does not mean emotions never matter. Of course they do, but the overthinking mind makes a serious mistake. It treats emotional intensity as proof of importance, and that is not always true. A strong feeling may simply mean your system is loaded, your body is tense, or your mind has already been spinning for too long. The strongest minds learn how to feel without worshipping every feeling. They learn how to let some states pass without building a whole theory around them. And once you can do that, the next lesson becomes much easier to live. Because overthinking loses a lot of its force when you stop demanding that uncertainty be solved immediately. The 10th lesson is this: train yourself to tolerate uncertainty. This is where a huge amount of overthinking is really coming from. Not from the situation itself, but from your mind's refusal to leave anything unresolved. It wants clarity now, safety now, final answers now. It wants to know exactly what people mean, exactly how things will go, exactly whether the choice was right, exactly whether the future is safe. And when it cannot get that certainty, it keeps spinning. That is the real trap. Because life does not give that kind of certainty very often. People are not always clear, outcomes are not always visible in advance. Decisions do not come with guarantees, feelings change, situations evolve, meaning takes time. And if your mind cannot tolerate that, it will keep trying to force certainty where certainty does not exist. That effort becomes overthinking. Most of the time, the problem is not that you do not have enough information. The problem is that your nervous system hates not knowing. Think about how often the mind asks questions it cannot settle simply because uncertainty feels unbearable. Are they upset with me? Did I choose wrong? What if this goes badly? What if I regret this? What if I missed something important? These questions are painful not only because they are unanswered, but because your mind keeps acting as if peace is impossible until they are answered perfectly. That is what keeps the loop alive. But peace does not begin when certainty arrives. Peace begins when you stop demanding certainty as the price of stability. That is the shift. You have to train yourself to leave some things unresolved without treating that as danger. To let a text remain unanswered for a while. To let a decision be imperfect. To let a conversation stay unfinished until there is more information. To let the future remain partly hidden without trying to mentally conquer it in advance. That is not weakness. That is psychological strength. It is the ability to remain steady in the presence of what has not been solved yet. A simple line can help here. I do not need to solve this right now to be okay right now. That sentence breaks a lot of false urgency because the overthinking mind keeps saying, resolve this, clarify this, control this, close this, answer this. But often none of that is available yet. And the more you keep trying to force it, the more agitated your mind becomes. Tolerating uncertainty does not mean you become passive. It means you stop making unresolved reality into an internal emergency. This is one of the clearest signs of a stronger mind. Not that it always knows, but that it can keep functioning when it does not know. It can stay open without collapsing. It can move forward without complete reassurance. It can wait without turning waiting into suffering. And once you can do that, something important starts growing in the background. Trust. Not trust that life will always go your way, but trust that you can handle what comes. And that is where the next lesson begins. The 11th lesson is this: build a mind that trusts itself. A lot of overthinking is not really about the situation in front of you. It is about your lack of trust in your own ability to handle what might happen next. The mind keeps obsessing in advance because it does not believe you can adapt later. It keeps rehearsing, reviewing, predicting, and doubting because it is trying to create safety before reality arrives. Underneath all that noise is a quiet fear. What if I cannot handle it? That is why overthinking is often a trust problem. If you deeply trusted your ability to respond, recover, adjust, and survive discomfort, your mind would not need to control every possibility so aggressively. It might still care, it might still plan, but it would not spiral the same way. The spiral happens because your mind believes that if it does not keep scanning every angle, you will be exposed, overwhelmed, or broken by what comes. But that belief is often outdated. You have already survived things you once thought would destroy you. You have adapted to disappointment, awkwardness, rejection, uncertainty, failure, change, regret, misunderstanding, and pain. You may not have handled everything perfectly, but you handled it enough to still be here. The problem is that overthinking rarely gives you credit for that. It keeps acting as if every new uncertainty is your first one, as if you have no evidence of resilience behind you. This is why self-trust has to be trained deliberately. You build it by noticing what happens when you stop over-managing everything and still survive. You build it by making decisions and seeing that you can live with imperfect outcomes. You build it by entering difficult moments and learning that discomfort is not collapse. You build it by keeping small promises to yourself, by acting when you are unsure, by letting life unfold without trying to mentally dominate it in advance. Every time you do that, you send a different message to the mind. I can handle more than you think. That message changes the whole internal atmosphere, because a mind that trusts itself does not need to obsess over every possible failure before taking action. It does not need to rehearse every conversation 5 times just to feel safe. It does not need to predict every emotional consequence in advance. It starts to understand something deeper. Even if this goes badly, I am still someone who can respond. Even if I feel pain, I can recover. Even if I make a mistake, I can correct. Even if I do not know exactly what happens next, I am not helpless. That is a very different inner position. Think about how much energy overthinking spends trying to guarantee safety. Then, imagine what happens when that energy is no longer needed in the same way. The mind gets quieter, not because life became certain, but because you became less fragile in your own eyes. The more your mind trusts your ability to meet reality, the less it tries to imprison you inside anticipation. And once that trust starts forming, the final lesson becomes crucial, because even a strong mind can become vulnerable at the wrong time of day. Overthinking gets louder when the structure of the day ends and the night is left unguarded. The 12th lesson is this: end the day before the mind hijacks the night. Overthinking gets louder at night for a reason. The day loses structure, the body gets tired, the mind becomes less defended. There is more silence, less friction, fewer tasks, fewer interruptions, and suddenly all the thoughts you managed to outrun during the day come back looking bigger than they really are. That is why night is so dangerous for an undisciplined mind. It gives mental noise too much room, and once the mind takes that room, it expands fast. A small worry becomes a life question. A minor, awkward moment becomes social humiliation. A practical problem becomes a full existential spiral. You lie there trying to solve things that would not even look serious in daylight. But now, the mind is tired, the body is still, and everything feels heavier than it is. That is not wisdom, that is vulnerability mixed with exhaustion. This is why you need an evening structure, not something complicated, something protective, a clear signal that the day is closing before the mind starts creating a second life in the dark. Fewer screens, less stimulation, no unnecessary emotional conversations late at night, no endless scrolling, no reopening complicated issues when your body is already depleted, no pretending that midnight is the best time to solve what you could not solve at noon. A strong evening routine is not boring, it is strategic. It protects your mind from drifting into unstructured review. It reduces the chances that passing emotion turns into philosophy. It helps your body come down before your thoughts start climbing, and that matters, because many people think they have a deep overthinking problem, when part of the problem is simply that they keep handing their most vulnerable hours to chaos. Think about how often the mind becomes cruelest when you are most depleted. Not because those thoughts suddenly became true, but because you are in the worst condition to challenge them. Tired minds interpret badly. Overstimulated minds exaggerate. Unstructured nights become perfect territory for mental spirals. So if you want inner calm, you cannot only manage thoughts. You have to protect the conditions that thoughts grow inside. A simple rule helps here. Do not let the night ask questions the morning should answer. That one line can save you a lot of unnecessary suffering. Not everything needs to be solved before sleep. Some things only need to be postponed until your mind is better equipped to look at them honestly. And once you learn that, the whole pattern starts becoming easier to break, because now you are no longer just reacting to overthinking after it takes over. You are building a life that gives it fewer openings in the first place. What makes overthinking so destructive is not only that it creates noise, it creates obedience. It teaches people to trust every fear, follow every loop, investigate every feeling, and keep trying to solve life from inside a mind that has already lost proportion. That is why so many people stay trapped. Not because they are weak, but because they never learned where the loop begins, what feeds it, and how to break it before it becomes their whole atmosphere. That is what these lessons were really about. Not becoming perfectly calm, not forcing your mind to be silent all the time, but becoming someone who notices faster, interrupts earlier, grounds more clearly, and trusts themselves enough not to obey every anxious thought. Someone who can separate facts from interpretation. Someone who knows when to move the body instead of feeding the mind. Someone who makes decisions before indecision grows roots. Someone who limits review, acts quickly, stops overreading emotion, tolerates uncertainty, builds self-trust, and protects the night before the spiral begins. Because overthinking does not make you more prepared. Most of the time, it just makes you more exhausted. It steals energy that should have gone to living. It turns uncertainty into identity. It teaches you to sit in rooms made of thought while life keeps moving somewhere else. So for the next 24 hours, try one thing. The next time you catch yourself looping, do not ask, how do I solve all of this right now? Ask, what is the next clean interruption? Name the thought. Return to the facts. Move your body. Make one decision. Take one real action. Then stop feeding the loop. Because peace does not begin when your mind finally answers every question. It begins when you stop letting every question control your mind.